Welcome back. We're closing out the series with the weirdest part: power, faith, and a guy who thinks chaos is basically the operating system. The whole thing gets into Trump, deplatforming, Catholicism, and why some people think collapse is already here. And honestly, it gets way more unhinged than it sounds. The Vance part is wild, because the argument is basically that he is a political product, not a political soul. Which, to be fair, is a very modern complaint. Like, if your whole rise depends on patronage, can you ever really be trusted? That's the question hanging over half of politics anyway. But the conversation doesn't stop at politics. It slides straight into religion and this idea that people are starving for structure. And that's where things get interesting, because it stops sounding like strategy and starts sounding like a diagnosis. Wait, hold on. When he says Trump is a warlord, that is not a casual metaphor. That is a full cosplay of political apocalypse. But he is making a point about how brutal politics rewards the least tender people. That's the part I can't just dismiss, because the incentive structure is real. Like, if every reward system selects for deception, you eventually get a room full of deceivers. Shocking, I know, the talent pool is not exactly full of saints. And then he says competence matters more than sincerity, which is such a cold line. It is cold, but he's not totally wrong either. Because people do worship emotional language like it's a substitute for being useful. Politicians cry, everybody claps, and then nothing gets built. But what bothered me more was the part about Trump not having a center. Like repeating the same self-praise in private, on the phone, for hours. That's not just ego, that's a whole internal broadcast channel. Imagine being stuck on a call with your own propaganda machine. The part where he says Trump can't admit fault is almost more alarming than the lying. Because if a leader can never course correct, every mistake becomes somebody else's problem. And then we get into this darker argument that the whole country created him, which is such a brutal mirror because it means the audience is part of the pathology. Nobody likes hearing that they helped make the monster. But that's basically what he's saying. The media, the party, the voters, all of it. And then he doubles down and says the masses are ignorant and fickle. That is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because it's half philosophy and half contempt. Very democratic of him, really. Like, thanks for the feedback, king of the people. But then the mood shifts into something genuinely bleak about decline. The idea that the best days are behind us is everywhere now. And he's framing it less as economics and more as a spiritual sickness. That actually lands harder than a normal political take. Because cynicism really does poison everything it touches. If people stop expecting fairness, they start behaving like fairness is a scam. Then the whole culture turns into self-defense and grievance. And he ties that straight into religion, which is where the interview gets unexpectedly sincere. The Catholic stuff is honestly the least trollish he sounds the whole time. He's talking about confession, Eucharist, grace, all of it like there is actual weight there. And the other guy is pushing back from a more modern, detached place. Which is probably the healthiest reaction to being told bread becomes God. A very fair thing to need a minute on. But I did get why that part resonated, because ritual is a real thing. People want something bigger than a motivational speaker in a warehouse. They want a cathedral, not a TED Talk with drums. Exactly, they want awe, not a guy with a headset yelling about purpose. And then he jumps into this theory that young people are returning to Christianity because nihilism is exhausting. That part feels plausible, even if his explanation is a little dramatic. If your moral framework disappears, people do start reaching for one fast, especially when everything else feels fake. But then he goes straight to mass shootings as a meaning problem, which is a huge leap. I get the logic, but that's also the kind of line that needs a lot more care. Still, the broader point is about nihilism turning into permission. And that's a depressing sentence, no matter how you slice it. The last stretch about chaos in the next 10 years really feels like the whole thesis. Government shutdowns, redistricting fights, party fragmentation, all of that gets treated like signs of breakdown. He even makes the case that the system is already in a kind of civil conflict, which is a great way to ruin everybody's afternoon. But it is consistent with his whole worldview. Every institution is splitting at the seams. And the funny thing is, when he says he thrives in chaos, I almost believe him. Some people need calm, and some people need the smoke. That's also why the ending lands the way it does, because he wants people to judge him fairly. He's basically asking for charity in a world he thinks is dishonest. And that is probably the most human line in the whole conversation. Even if you disagree with almost everything else, that need is recognizable. Anyway, that's the final episode. And we went from Trump to theology to civil collapse without even trying that hard. Which feels about right for this series, honestly. Thanks for riding through all 4 episodes with us. We'll see you in the next one, and hopefully the next topic is only slightly less chaotic. Welcome back. This one gets into power, faith, and why everyone sounds allergic to accountability. And somehow it still ends up feeling like a whole country having a nervous breakdown. The wild part is how quickly it jumps from Trump to theology to civil collapse. That is a very online chain of thought, and I mean that lovingly. But the interview does make one point pretty hard to ignore. It says people at the top are usually built by the mess, not above it. And that is where I start going, okay, wait, are we praising the right thing here? Because he survives the knife fight is not exactly a glowing resume line. It sounds cool until you remember he still has to run the country. That whole argument about competence being more compassionate is actually strong. I hate how much I kinda get it, even while rolling my eyes. Because in real life, sincerity without skill can become a disaster machine. But there is still something creepy about acting like feeling nothing is a virtue. Yeah, that part bothered me too, because it turns leadership into pure appetite. And then the interview almost admits that the whole system rewards that exact appetite. It is very, we made the monster, but we also hate the monster. That's the most depressing part, honestly, because it is self-aware corruption. He keeps saying the media, the parties, and the public all selected this outcome. Which is convenient because then nobody ever has to change. Everyone gets to blame the whole civilization and go home. The weirdest thing is how often the conversation lands on spiritual exhaustion. That idea actually feels more real than the political stuff sometimes. Like people are not just mad, they are empty and suspicious. And once that happens, every institution starts looking fake. Which is why the religion section matters more than it first seems. Because it is not really about Catholic trivia, it is about structure. And also about how weirdly theatrical non-denominational church can feel. The strip mall church versus cathedral comparison is brutal, but fair. I get the point, though, because ritual can carry weight even when belief is shaky. And for a lot of people, the ritual is the last thread left. That is why the return to Christianity among young people feels less like fashion and more like panic. Panic, but also hunger, because nihilism is a bad long-term lifestyle. Eventually, even your most aggressive opinions want a little metaphysics. Facts, your soul eventually asks for a manager. But I do think the interview is right that people want meaning, not just information. And when they do not get it, they start making chaos their identity. That is where the whole mass cynicism thing gets bleak because it feeds itself. Then you get politicians performing morality without believing any of it. Which is basically the full circle joke of modern public life. Campaign logo on one side, spiritual void on the other. And honestly, that might be the most honest part of the whole thing. Because at least the lie is visible now instead of decorated. Still, there is a difference between seeing corruption clearly and romanticizing it. That's my biggest hesitation with the whole warlord frame. It can explain power, but it can also excuse too much. And once you excuse enough, you stop demanding better adults in the room. The interview keeps circling that tension between realism and resignation. Like, are we describing the world or are we surrendering to it? Because those are not the same thing, even if they sound similar. Though to be fair, half of political commentary is just surrender with nicer lighting. That is a very depressing sentence, but it is annoyingly good. The shutdown, the redistricting, the constant state versus federal tension, all of it feels brittle. And brittle is the right word, because nobody seems to trust the glue anymore. That is why the next 10 years part hit me the hardest. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is emotionally believable. I do not know if chaos is inevitable, but I definitely get why people are bracing for it. And once you start bracing, you stop participating normally. Which might be the real civic collapse, honestly. The faith part matters because it is one of the few things trying to restore a center. Not perfect, not clean, but at least a center. And a person without a center is exactly what the interview keeps accusing Trump of being. That accusation is doing a lot of work, but it does feel psychologically sharp. Also, repeating your own slogans in private is just an incredible image. Imagine being trapped in a phone call with your own campaign ad. But the darker point is that propaganda can become personality. And once that happens, nobody knows where the actual person went. That is kind of tragic, even if the person is deeply unlikable, which annoyingly makes the whole thing more human instead of less. So the interview ends up being less about one man and more about a culture. A culture that rewards performance, distrusts sincerity, and then acts shocked. Classic civilization behavior, honestly. We really do keep acting surprised by our own software. If nothing else, that is what made this final episode worth sitting with. It is not comfortable, but it is recognizable. And that is the end of the 4-part run, which somehow got more intense every week. We started with politics and ended up basically staring into the national soul. Thanks for being here for all of it, seriously. We appreciate you riding through the chaos with us. If you listen to the whole series, you are either loyal or slightly unwell. Probably both, which is honestly the best audience. We will see you next time, and hopefully the next topic has fewer existential threats. Welcome back. We are closing this out by staring directly at power, faith, and chaos, which is a very normal, relaxing way to end a series, obviously. What got me was how everything became about survival, not belief. Yeah, and that is where I start getting nervous about the whole thing. The Trump stuff felt less like politics and more like watching a guy become a machine. A machine with spray tan and a hostile relationship with accountability. Exactly. And the wild part is the interview treats that like a feature. Like he is lying, but somehow the lie is supposed to be honesty. That logic is so slippery it should come with a warning label. But I get the appeal, because regular polish feels fake to people now. Everybody is allergic to the performative version of sincerity. And that is why a guy like Trump reads as weirdly transparent to some people. Transparent in the way a casino floor is transparent. Yes, exactly. You know what game is being played immediately. The scary part is when the interview says he lies to himself too. That is the line that actually hits hardest for me. Because if the performance becomes the person, where is the center? That is the unsettling thing. There might not be one anymore. And if there is no center, every crisis just makes him louder. Which is terrible because leadership is supposed to reduce panic. Instead, it sometimes feels like he feeds on the panic. Yet the interview keeps landing on competence over compassion. That part is more interesting than the usual moral shouting match. People want results, then act shocked when the person delivering them is ugly. Democracy is basically hiring the least terrible contractor. That is such a depressing but accurate way to say it. But do you think the interview is right that compassion is overrated? I think that is a convenient thing to say if you already admire toughness. Competence matters, sure, but compassion is not decorative. Like, if the person is effective but morally numb, what are we even celebrating? Probably just our own desperation if I am being annoying about it. You are always a little annoying about it, but that is why it works. The interview's bigger claim is that society built this kind of leader. That part I actually buy more than the personality worship. If every incentive rewards aggression, eventually aggression becomes the brand. And then everyone acts surprised when the brand behaves like aggression. It is very "we made this, why is it attacking us" energy. The discussion about Vance and patrons felt similar. Right, the whole idea that one donor or one power network makes the career. That part always makes politics sound like a rigged talent show, which, to be fair, is one of the more generous descriptions. And then Palantir enters the chat like the surveillance boss fight. That exchange was actually fascinating because it had a real tension to it. He wants strong federal power for immigration, but not for surveillance, which is a very easy line to draw if your priorities already match. The problem is the state never stays neatly in one lane forever. Power accumulates, then everybody pretends they can control the shape of it. And the faith section felt like a sudden inhale after all that political smoke. Yeah, like the conversation remembered humans exist for a second. I actually liked how the Catholic imagery grounded the whole thing. The ritual, the confession, the Eucharist, all of that has weight. Way more weight than a church stage with a fog machine, honestly. I was waiting for you to dunk on the strip mall church the whole time. I respect a cathedral more than a branded worship experience. But the deeper point is that people want structure when meaning feels thin. Especially young people who feel like the future is missing its instructions. That nihilism discussion was bleak but not stupid. When morality becomes just be nice, it starts sounding optional. And that is when the conversation gets really dark, really fast. Because if there is no shared moral frame, everything becomes personal preference. Then everybody thinks their impulse is philosophy, which is basically the internet in one sentence. I did think the interview was most honest when it admitted people are fake. Fake Christians, fake politicians, fake public morality, all of it. That is a brutal worldview, but it explains a lot of how people act. The issue is that once you believe everybody is fake, trust gets crushed. And then you stop looking for truth and start hunting for leverage. Which is probably why the final stretch turned into Civil War talk so fast. That part escalated like 3 gears in 30 seconds. The shutdowns, redistricting, the public breakdown of cooperation, all of it feels brittle. Even the disagreement felt less like policy and more like social fracture. I do think people hear that and immediately think, is he exaggerating? He probably is, but not by enough to make it reassuring. That is the least comforting possible answer, which means it is usable. What I keep coming back to is that everyone sounded exhausted by the system. Even when they disagreed, nobody sounded hopeful about institutions. Yeah, it was less, we can fix this, and more, we are living inside it. And that is why the fourth turning idea lands for people, even if it is messy. I do not love cyclical destiny talk, but I get the appeal. It gives chaos a shape, which humans are always trying to do. We love a narrative almost as much as we love being right. That should be embroidered on a pillow somewhere. The ending message was basically, listen in good faith, then decide. Which is funny because that sounds simple, but it is rare now. Most people show up already armored and ready to hate. I think that is the biggest series takeaway for me. Not that one side is pure and the other is evil, but that everyone is spiraling. And the weirdest part is that the spiral has become normal. Which is a fantastic note to end a podcast series on, by the way. We really did choose light topics for the finale. But seriously, thanks for riding through all 4 episodes with us. We appreciate you sticking around for the messy parts too. If you made it here, you are either thoughtful or completely addicted. Or you just had the volume on in the background and got trapped. Either way, we love that for you. We will be back soon, and hopefully the next one is less apocalyptic. No promises, but we can dream.